But there's state of birth, which will be important. The census ACS, this we are using as a population estimator, as a population-based denominator for the mortality rates, but also for the socioeconomic outcomes. There we have years of education, but we also have state of birth. And then we also use the CPS, where we have years of education, but we don't have the state of birth, or just the state of residence. And in general, the CPS, because our analysis will be by state of birth, and in the CPS, we use the state of residence as a proxy for state of birth, which of course has its own issues, but we show that these problems are not really biasing our results. And finally, we need some state level unemployment rates. And there we use the BLS data that's from 1976 onwards. And what that means in total is that we have like a sample period we can work from 1979 to 2016. And the core cohorts, so in general, when we look at like long-term outcomes at older ages, we're always making sure that we always include cohorts that we can observe at all ages, right? That's so that we kind of compare the same groups over age. And so the core cohorts that we can observe up to age 49, 50 are those born in 60 to 67, and those are graduating around the 1982 recession. So that we should keep in mind that in general, we are speaking here, like our natural experiment is focused on the recessions graduating around the cohorts graduating around the 82 recession, but we also show the data in the paper that like we can expand the cohort window, or we can look at different recessions, and the results overlap very nicely for the age ranges that we can analyze in those different windows. So how do we deal with this problem that we don't observe state and year of graduation, and that could be endogenous? So we use this approach that we call the double weighted approach. So the regression that we are running is very similar, so like the same as before, except that now we have here what we call the double weighted unemployment rate at graduation. And so what we do is that we divide the entire population into cohorts defined by state and year of birth, right? That's stuff that can't be impacted by a recession later on, or by like the conditions around the time when people graduate. And then of course we have to attach to those cohorts some the unemployment rate, or like a time and a place of graduation. And what we do there is that we use ACS and census data to estimate the average migration education rates of cohorts born in a given state in a given year, right? And in particular, we don't use the cohort's own specific graduation and education timing, but we use the education and migration patterns of the surrounding cohorts, right? So we get a predictor of like where these people will be, in a normal year, and when do they graduate in normal times. And this gives us a strong predictor of like what's actually happening to them, but at the same time that is not affected by local recessions. So it is not subject to this endogeneity concern. However, because we can construct this at the level of state and year of birth, we can then bring it back to the mortality data, where we also have those variables, and can run the regression here with also mortality on the left-hand side. And of course, this double weighting means we reduce a little bit of variation because we're averaging, but here we see the residual unemployment rate at the state level on the left-hand side when we take out year and state fixed effects over time, different states here. And this is the double weighted one. So we see, the y-axis, the range is a little bit lower, but we still have plenty of variation to estimate our effects. Okay, first let's look at impacts on career development and family formation, because that's something where like the existing literature has focused on, particular in terms of like earnings and labor market outcomes. And if we look at like life cycle models there, like what are the predictions, like what could we expect there? So the idea is in papers like Gibbons-Waldman or Oreopoulos from Wacht and Heiss, is that these recession graduates, they start in lower quality jobs. And starting in those jobs means they accumulate worse or less skills on the job. And that means that they never fully catch up, because even if over time they kind of like switch jobs and get into better jobs that are more fitting to their actual type, right? Even if they are switching jobs, they will always lag behind in terms of like on the job skills that were accumulated, and the lucky cohorts have accumulated already a longer tenure of on the job skills. So that means there could be persistent effects, and importantly, wage gaps could widen again in midlife when like the careers of these unlucky cohorts are stalling, right? And there's no more promotion and there's no more wage growth, while those who are in a lucky start and accumulated more human capital like on the job, they can see continuous increases.
Honest,
And
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Effects on labor supply is in general like ambiguous. In terms of family formation, we look at different time horizons here. In the short run, fertility is always procyclical. That has been shown very consistently. So during recessions, fertility goes down. But then in the medium run, it's very likely that flat career paths make it cheaper to have family, start family formation earlier. And then in the long run, it could be that like it's most likely that the lower incomes and the worst match of family formation, of this early family formation, may reduce fertility again. And so now I'm showing you effects for labor market outcomes and for family formation. And I'm going to show you these plots of this beta coefficient over age. And what we see in general is that this shows like the impact of a 1 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate on different outcomes across age. And we see here first these strong impacts on log earnings that have been found by the existing literature, but then we see that this gap is persistent, or the negative impacts persistent around like -1%, even in the long run. And this is driven both by like lower wages as well as less, hours worked. Even though interestingly, at the extensive margin, people seem to work more. And there's also actually a higher share of part-time work. And this also spills into household finances. So we see like lower household income, less house ownership. And interestingly, if we look at transfers, we see in midlife an increase of like Social Security, income, Medicare, and also work disability. That's like a foreshadowing of the mortality effects that we're going to see. Family formation, we interestingly find first that people are more likely to get married and have children earlier on, but then in the long run, since these matches seem to be as persistent, we see lower marriage rates and we see less cohabitation with children, and we also see here like similar economic outcomes for spouses. So there seems to be lower quality matches. Okay, now very briefly on the mortality effects. So interesting enough, even though of course mortality is such a central outcome, there's been very little theoretical work on mortality. And for example, Grossman, the famous Grossman health model, doesn't talk about mortality. And we are lucky to have Adriana here today because we really she has this kind of like leading new model on mortality. And the important thing here, and maybe Adriana will talk a little bit more about that, is that in this model that's based with has health investments, age depreciation, and random shocks, the health differences, if you have different investments, they always increase with age, or the mortality differences, because that's as you age, like this mortality, the health difference become more and more important. So whether you have temporary or persistent reduction in investments, both of those investment reductions lead to increasing age gaps in mortality. So just looking at mortality in levels doesn't really tell us a difference whether there's like a temporary or persistent reduction in investments. However, log mortality is very different in that it only increases, the log mortality impact only increases with persistent investment reductions, and it strictly decreases with temporary reductions. And finally, just like note that, of course, the famous room literature shows that temporarily in the very short run, recessions actually might improve health investment and health shocks. So, you know, again, against the idea that maybe in the short run, we shouldn't really find negative health investments, negative health shocks. Again, I'm going to show you these beta coefficients, and what we see here for the impact on mortality and levels, we see that first, actually, there is a negative impact. So that's in line like with the room literature, right? Like this, that's a temporary effect, meaning like higher unemployment rate leads to less mortality. Then there's not so much going on in the 20s and 30s, but then in the late 30s, we see this increasing positive impact on mortality.
And Jonas, you're exactly at 15 minutes.
Perfect. Interestingly, if we look at this levels effect again, if we look at logs, we see that also the logs effect is increasing. So following Adriana's model would suggest that we have not temporary, but some persistent reductions in health investments. And those effects are largely driven by disease-related deaths. The short-term impact is all driven by accidents, actually, in the short run. In terms of the magnitude of effects, of course, you have to make assumptions of like what's the you know, what's the persistent effect over age. And if we make kind of a strong assumption that we say the age impacts, like they continue to increase in levels, or they continue to be like around 2% in logs, then we get that for stronger recessions, that's the 82 recession, 3.5 percentage point increase in unemployment rate, we see that the life expectancy per capita is reduced by 6 to 9 months. So that's quite substantial, because like on average 6 to 9 months are reduced just because we were unlucky and had an unlucky start. Okay, just to conclude, we find increased midlife mortality for those graduating in the early 80s recessions. They're accompanied by persistent earnings losses and, you know, socioeconomic decline. And those patterns are in line with life cycle models looking at those different factors. And overall, the bottom line is that the impacts of entry conditions might be much more broader and more persistent than we have previously thought. Thank you.
Great. Okay, everybody, I deeply apologize for getting confused about the time. So I will return to my rightful role as chair. So Adriana Yarazmini will now discuss for 5 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions.
Okay. Hannes, can you on share so I can share? Hold on. All right. All right. So let me get started. Thank you so much for having me here. So we just saw the paper, so I'm not going to summarize it. I'm going to say something that I really like about this paper is that it looks at the dynamic treatment effects. And I think it's very helpful because it helps us reconcile kind of what we see in the short run in the room papers with what we see in the long run, kind of in the cross section across individuals or countries. And it's very nice to see those figures. And it also, I think, kind of shows you that the effects of the treatment effects that we measure vary substantially on when they're measured. So at some point, the effects that are measured could be 0, but that could be very highly deceiving. At some point, they're positive. At some point, it's negative. And so the effects on mortality really are very heterogeneous. And it's really important to look at kind of the whole life cycle effects. The other thing that's interesting is that, as many people suspect, the effects of mortality of some of these outcomes are only visible when mortality itself starts rising and it's sufficiently large, so only appear in middle age. And so again, it can be very deceiving to look at people who are still young and estimate effects. It's also then has some kind of importance for our own evaluation of kind of the health effects or of policies or of shocks, that we really need to see kind of, or think about the entire profile of effects before we make conclusions about, for instance, policy interventions. I think a next step for here that would be interesting would be maybe for another paper, I want to say, maybe to kind of improve the model. because there's a kind of a lot of outcomes that are being considered, and there's a discussion about how they might link together. And in this paper, it might be helpful for the reader to at least do these acrylic graphs that Judea Pearl is so fond of. So I took the liberty of providing one here, which I think these are very kind of controversial and stuff. But I think that what's interesting is to kind of think of what exactly are the mechanisms, and they're complicated, but we have labor market entrance being kind of the T0 moment that affects employment and income. Both of these two things are different. You know, employment has something to do with what you're doing with your time, and income is how much money you have. And these themselves have effects on a lot of intermediate behaviors: where you live, the environmental pollutants that you're exposed to, your ability to marry and have children, your health behaviors or healthcare access, and things like your rank and the stress that you experience in society. So these are kind of thought as mechanisms that affect health, which in terms determines mortality. And I think what's important here is what I'm putting at the bottom, which I think that to fully understand the dynamics that we're observing here, there's some important kind of feedback loops. You know, there's employment effects that affect marriage, and then marriage effects that affect employment and income. And so there's kind of a back and forth loop in here. And this is already, of course, a very super simplified model, because I'm not even talking about how marriage might affect health behaviors and other things like that. But I think it's helpful to kind of start thinking about this, and maybe in future work, kind of combine some more detailed model of the dynamics of the health formation and marriage formation and health behaviors with mortality. Another thing that I think would be really interesting in this paper is that, you know, is to link it more with the literature on SES gradients. So health and mortality vary systematically by SES, measured by education, income, occupation, and race. The paper doesn't really report results by education level, and Hannah's made a point that, you know, that it's difficult to do this, but a lot of the work that they cite, like particularly Case and Deaton, does compute mortality rates by education level. And I think it would be worth reporting. And I think when you look at their results on the effects of labor market outcomes, those are different by education level, and the mortality effects and health effects are likely to be different by education. Similarly, there are some interesting differences by race and by gender that are kind of worth exploring. So these results kind of suggest there's a larger impact of shocks on maybe lower SES individuals, or that they have more shocks. And I think they could push this link between their findings and the SES gradient kind of further, and to talk about, you know, many of the papers that they're citing relating. So I kind of want to finish with a point about like something that I found myself thinking. So sorry, that was my 5 minutes. So I'm gonna stop that. Sorry. So we had two major recessions since 1982, the 2008 and the COVID, and the paper started by talking about this. The paper paints a pretty dire picture for these generations. It'd be interesting to use the coefficients from this paper to do predictions for what we expect for COVID. It would also be interesting to dig deeper into trying to understand if there are any factors, particularly any policies, that lessen the impact of the 1982 recession on these lifetime kind of outcomes. And I end with a note that it's interesting to further think about how this might transmit to kind of other next generations. And I'm out of time, so I'm going to finish there. Sorry. Thank you.
Great. Okay, we have time for questions, both from the panelists and from participants.
Thanks, Adriana, by the way.
And Hannes, if you want to respond quickly, that's also permissible.
Perfect. Yeah, no, I just like one comment on the education grades. I mean, yeah, all of these comments very, very well taken, and definitely food for next steps. One issue with education is just that we treat educational attainment as endogenous, and you know, you would have to relax that assumption to look at things by education. But at least, I mean, maybe it's not such a strong assumption. I think in general, you know, it's not it doesn't seem to bias results so much if one assumes it's exogenous. And in the census ACS, like for the socioeconomic outcomes, it's very straightforward to use education, much more so than for mortality. So that's definitely something one could do.
I totally understand your concern that this is endogenous, and in work that I've done, people would bring this up, that the timing of graduation might vary, and so I'm very sensitive to that concern. But I think in your own work, in the work that I've done, we typically find that correcting for that doesn't matter so much.
Yeah, that's true.
And on the other hand, it would be really great to be able to at least give a sense of how these differ by education, because I think in other work, one typically finds less educated individuals are much more impacted by these recessions, and so then it would be very easy to link to the SES gradient in health. You know, they're more impacted by these recessions, and you can kind of trace the whole impact and show how this results in big gradients in old age. And so I think you're like a small step away from doing that.
Other questions? I had a question. So Hannes, it seems like, you know, you don't even need really, you need cohort mortality data to do this, but you don't really even need the labor market data if you're just willing to take, you know, kind of unemployment in the year that you turn 18 as your treatment, right? Then it's kind of and then it seems like you could then go very far back and, you know, look at this by, you know, by gender, by race. Maybe Adriana, I'm guessing from your smile that you're doing this or have done this.
We have for a long time talked about that and like looked at different data sources and so on. It turns out to be a little bit more tricky than like to find like state level data on, you know, of course, there's a lot of state level data on labor market conditions, but get a consistent time series that is like, yeah, that really lets you link stuff over time is a little bit more tricky.
Yeah, no, I think it's sorry, go ahead.
I can say, you know, so I tried to work with Hannes and Till on this, and the issue is that before 1979, there's no state of birth in the death certificates. And that's the other one, yeah. And that is a big issue in trying to push these results backwards. So,
but do you need state level? Sorry, go ahead, Steve.
Oh no, I was just going to say that I actually think this idea, I really like what you do by worrying about these adjustments and how you take this predicted year of entering the labor market. But I think there's a real value to doing something a little more non-parametric, which is like what David just spoke about, which is, you know, what is the effect of unemployment when you're 18? What is the effect of the unemployment rate when you're 19? What is the effect of the unemployment rate when you're 22 or 23? Given that, you know, some people might be four-year graduates, some people might not go to college. That's going to really vary, and it's going to be affected by the business cycle. But there should be some type of non-parametric year-by-year effect on what the business cycle look like over these critical, let's say 17 to 24, 25 time period. And just describing that empirically would be really valuable. And I think it would give us a lot more insights to try to make more progress on these questions, right? If you do it for the labor market, then you have the non-parametric surface. Now you can apply it to these other outcomes where the data is not quite so rich and it's harder to make progress, keeping that non-parametric surface as fixed, you know, conditioning on it.
So I think like the one first to David's point, the problem really is that like mortality, so much is happening to mortality, most like positive things. So, you know, mortality is declining strongly, and those predictions for the 82 recession cohort, every 2 years we make the same increase in life expectancy as like this full impact would have been, like this like 8 months or something. And then of course you have the HIV AIDS epidemic, you have opioids. There's always so much happening that you really have to filter all of that stuff out at the national level to get to this kind of like smaller changes, right? I mean, these things are like these are like intent to treat effects for whole cohorts, right? So we are not talking about like suddenly 10% of the cohort dying, right? That's the one thing. And the other thing is in terms of like identifying variation, you know, like Steve, like your idea was to say, let's estimate those profiles for all different ages, right? Like exposure at 16, 17, 18, 19. And this just means, right, you know, you have to like, you would have to, you know, divide your t values by 20 or something to get all of those individual impacts. And I think even though the US is a large country, you know, we have all these different stages, it's great. We have like the best mortality data going backwards, like for a large country. You get to the limits very quickly already with this analysis, and I think that's the tricky part a little bit. I would love to do that more.
But I think you could do that for earnings. I'm not saying you could do that for
That's
mortality.
true.
You could do it for earnings, and then take the surface you've estimated and use it for these more challenging questions like marriage or mortality, where you're not going to have as much information.
No, that's a great point. That's a great point.
We should
also,
move
like
on.
Till is here. Okay, we probably.
But I'm going to abuse my privilege just for 1 sec. You can use census data to measure mortality by looking at who's missing, right? So you know how many people were born in a given state year, and then you know in the aggregate data your people report state of birth. So in theory, you can look for mortality.
That's Adriana's
I see that right? I'm only suggesting things you guys have thought about. Okay, so let us. So this is great and a great conversation. Let's move on to Jamie Ariano Bover. And Jamie is going to speak about the effect of labor market conditions on workers' long-term skills. And you have 15 minutes, Jamie.
Okay, great. So thank you. Let me tell you the effect of labor market conditions at entry on workers' long-term skills. So we know that the first steps in the labor market are key in the long term for young people. This is what this session is all about. Like we have just seen a great example. There is by now a pretty large literature on how graduating in bad or good times can have sizable and persistent consequences. In some related work, I have shown how even conditional on initial macroeconomic conditions, the type of firm where workers get their first job can also have career-long consequences. But in spite of this mounting evidence, our understanding of why is it that initial conditions are so key is a bit more limited than what we would like. There are two big buckets of explanations that could lead to this. The first ones have to do with different types of labor market frictions. So things such as search frictions, mobility costs, or imperfect information, all of those could result in that even if we keep constant young workers' productive capacity, those who enter in bad times might get stuck at bad jobs, they might get thrown to the bottom rungs of a hard to climb job ladder, or they might be penalized for thin resumes. On the other hand, we have explanations related to human capital. This idea that if on-the-job learning is an important component of human capital acquisition and wage growth, a shock to the foundations of this process, that is the early experiences, could put young workers on different human capital trajectories and in turn lead to persistent consequences. So in a nutshell, what I do in this paper is to test for the existence and the importance of the human capital channel. So what I do is I estimate the effect of labor market entry conditions on workers' long-term skills. And the key innovation of the paper is that rather than using data on compensation or employment and then trying to indirectly infer something about skills, I'm going to be using data on actual measures of worker skills. And this data come from the PIAC survey of adult skills, which is an international survey run by the OECD, which I will be using. And I will be using data from 19 countries of this survey. And for each of these countries, I have a representative cross-section of adult workers. And I will say more in just a couple of slides, but let me just say that the skills that this survey captures are cognitive skills that are quite general and that they're work relevant. So in the paper, I start with a conceptual framework that I'm not going to go in details here, but I wanted to summarize. The conceptual framework helps set ideas, and I derive some predictions that I test in the data. So think of young people in their late teens and early 20s, and they have to choose whether they extend their formal education or where they enter the labor market. And both of these are options in, they're situations in which you can increase your skills, either at school or on the job. These choices are made with the objective of maximizing skill development in the long term, keeping in mind that formal education is costly, and it's going to be costly to a degree that varies across different people. On top of this, macroeconomic conditions can be good or bad, and the way that this impacts skill acquisition is because in the framework, on-the-job learning is cyclical. That is, that in bad times or in recession, what you learn on the job is diminished. But learning in formal education is not. The assumption is that what you learn at school is unaffected by macroeconomic conditions or the state of the labor market. So from this simple framework, there are three main predictions that I will test. The first one is that when macroeconomic conditions are bad, a higher share of young people will choose to extend their formal education. This insight is not new. This is in line with previous literature and comes simply from the fact that the opportunity cost of extending education is lower. And I simply verify that this indeed occurs in my data and my empirical context, which is important to understanding the main results. The second prediction, which is the most important one, is that the effect of bad macroeconomic conditions has an ambiguous effect on average skills in the long term. And the reason for this is that different people are affected differently by bad conditions. And you can think of these young people into three categories. There are those who, regardless of macroeconomic conditions, will choose to extend their formal education. And for this, in this framework, the level of skills will be unaffected because they're shielded from bad or good conditions. Then there are some young workers who will choose to enter the labor market if they see that the macroeconomic conditions are good, but in bad times, they will choose to stay longer at school and extend their education. For this group of people, the framework would predict that they will actually have higher skills as a result of bad macroeconomic conditions. This is under the assumption that people learn more at school than on the job. And finally, you have those people who would enter the labor market regardless. And for those, bad macroeconomic conditions hurts their skill accumulation in the long term because they are the ones that rely on the job learning. So as you can see, the net effect for a given cohort that experiences bad macroeconomic conditions will depend on the shares of these groups of people and also on how large is the cyclicality of on-the-job learning. And I will test this effect using the data on skills and using country level unemployment rates as a measure of macroeconomic conditions. The last prediction is kind of a corollary of the second. And it simply says that for those with the highest education costs, which are those who enter the labor market regardless, the effect on their skills is unambiguous and they will be hurt. And in the empirics, this will translate in that I will study these effects heterogeneously, but for young people, for people whose parents have more or less education. I think this is interesting per se, and in connection to the framework, you can think of parental education as a proxy for heterogeneous education costs. This is the idea that those whose parents have more education or are wealthier will have lower costs of extending their education. Okay, so in terms of data, as I said, I'm using this survey, which is called the PIAC Service Adult Skills, which is run by the OECD, and its main purpose is to measure cognitive skills of representative samples of adults across many different countries. The survey is designed to measure skills that they are useful, general, learnable, and relevant for the labor market. As I said, I'm using data from 19 different countries. I have a cross-section for each one of them. These were carried out between 2011 and 2015. The survey consists of a questionnaire asking about the labor market, their education, and things about their life, and then an assessment which measures respondents' cognitive skills. The typical sample size per country is between 5,000 to 6,000 people. And in this paper, I focused on experienced workers, those who are ages 36 and above. The idea is that for these workers, their prime skill learning years are mostly over. So this table here is showing, on the one hand, showing information on the other piece of the data, which is the time series of unemployment rates that I collect going back to the late 1960s from different sources. More interestingly, maybe the table also shows the countries that go into my sample. So in blue, you have countries in Europe. You can see that most of the countries in my sample come from Europe. Europe is very well represented, but there are also countries from other places in the world. We have Chile from Latin America, Israel and Turkey from the Middle East, and Japan and South Korea from East Asia. This figure here represents the variation that I will be using. So for each birth cohort in each country in my data, I compute the average unemployment rate that that birth cohort encountered between ages 18 to 25. And the motivation for focusing between ages 18 to 25 is that across all these countries with different education systems and different labor market dynamics, this is the years in which typically most people will make the transition from education to work and spend the first few years in the labor market. So for each country, first of all, I standardized the unemployment rate. So each country's time series has mean 0 and standard deviation 1. And this heat map here shows in darker colors cohorts that experience higher average unemployment rates between these ages. And you can see that there is quite rich variation, meaning that across different countries, different cohorts experience higher or lower unemployment rates, and that the cohort trends also differ by country. So my empirical approach is, as I said, to use this sample of experienced workers and using the variation that I just showed you, I estimate linear regressions of this type where the outcome variable is the level of skills of a given person. There are 2 dimensions of skills in the survey. I look at both numeracy and literacy. And the main regression of interest is this average unemployment rate that person experienced between ages 18 to 25. And then the coefficient of interest is this beta. Then the regression also includes country fixed effects, age fixed effects, and a country-specific quadratic age trend, as well as some predetermined worker covariates such as gender, parents' education, and birthplace. So the previous specification estimates the impact of higher employment rates during the late teens and early 20s, freely allowing the subsequent unemployment rates to evolve. And an alternative is to keep constant these subsequent unemployment rates. And this is what I do in this alternative specification, which not only controls for the average unemployment rate between ages 18 to 25, but also the average between 26 and 30 and 31 or 35. So this specification here not only tells me the effect of the early unemployment rates keeping constant the subsequent ones, but it's also going to be interesting to compare beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3. This is going to be informative about the importance of early versus late shocks. And there are different models of human capital accumulation, which would argue that due to sensitive investment periods or due to dynamic complementarities, we might expect that the period which matters the most is the initial one as compared to the later ones.
Maybe just a reminder that you have 5 minutes remaining.
Okay, thanks. So these are the main results from the regressions I just showed you. Here I'm showing you effects for numeracy skills, and I'm showing you first results that do not control for later unemployment rates. The first column does not include controls. The second one includes controls. And what this number tells us is that experiencing average unemployment rates between 18 to 25 that are higher by 1 standard deviation is associated with lower numeracy skills many years later on by around -5. And this -5 is not very informative on its own. These are the units in which these skills are measured, but it might be a useful benchmark to look at the standard deviation, which is around 50. So this is more or less 10% of a standard deviation. Once that we control for subsequent unemployment rates, what we find is that the initial labor market conditions are still important, and if so, the effects are larger. Now this is around 14% of a standard deviation. However, unemployment rates that people experience later on between their late 20s and their early 30s have a substantially smaller effect, and they're not different from 0. They're not statistically significantly different from 0. So this, again, lends support to this idea that the early experiences are going to matter for skill acquisition, later ones, not so much, even if they are closer in time to the actual point where these skills are measured. Once that we look at literacy skills, the picture is quite similar. You see negative effects on literacy skills of initial bad macroeconomic conditions. The effects of later conditions are more muted and not different from 0. Compared to numeracy skills, the effects are, in any case, effects on literacy skills are smaller, but the overall picture is quite consistent. So the next thing that I ask is, whether these skill losses are very different for workers from different socioeconomic backgrounds. So what I'm going to, the goal of this is to better understand how the skill losses are distributed across different types of workers. So what I estimate essentially is this specification here, and each of these coefficients, I going to estimate it separately for 3 groups of workers as a function of the education level of their parents. So workers whose parents had low versus medium versus high education. And this is graphically what I'm showing you here. So on the horizontal axis, you have the ages at which unemployment rates are experienced. And then each of these rows corresponds to workers whose parents had low education, medium education, or high education. The first things to notice is that the effect of later unemployment rates, they are still not, do not have an impact for any of these groups. However, the negative impacts of the early unemployment rates, we see that the overall negative effect that we saw before is mostly driven by workers whose parents had the low education compared to medium or high. You see that there is a monotonic relationship, and in fact, the estimates for medium and high education, highly educated parents are not statistically significant, while the ones for low educated parents are. Okay, so the last thing that I'm going to show you is that I explore a potential mechanism. The idea is to test whether part of this, at least, could be driven by different learning at different types of firms. This builds on the conceptual framework, and it considers the possibility that at least part of the cyclical and the job learning is driven by young workers matching with different types of employers in good versus bad times, and the possibility that the employers with whom young workers match in bad times are worse for skill building. So what do I do here? I am going to use the PIAC now only for Germany. The nice thing about Germany is that the one country in the PIAC sample that actually followed up their respondents and assessed their skills once again. So for German workers, I have a 2-period panel on their skills. Using this panel, I want to test for differential skill growth at heterogeneous firms, where the dimension of heterogeneity that I'm going to consider is firm size. And the motivation for choosing firm size is, on the one hand, a vast literature that shows that firm size is associated with higher productivity, higher wages, greater worker training, use of new technologies, but also more linked to this other literature of entering in a recession. There is evidence that shows that workers who enter in bad macroeconomic conditions are less likely to match with large firms and more likely to match with small firms. So what do I do with my German panel of skills? I estimate regressions of the following type, where I have the skill level of a given worker in the second period, and I control for their skill level at baseline. And then I allow the skill growth to vary as a function of the size of the firm where they're employed, where the baseline is the smallest set of firms, and then each of these are dummies for being employed in one of these size categories. And
okay, I just want to note that you're a little bit over a minute over, so you should definitely finish up the next minute or two.
Yes, I will. Thanks. I estimate this, allowing these differentials to vary by age. Long story short, what I find is that young workers experience greater skill growth at the largest set of firms. So the differential skill growth for firms between 11 and 1,000 workers are not statistically different from the baseline of the smallest firms. Young workers employed in the largest set of firms, especially the ones that are the youngest, experience greatest skill growth. And I had in some new work, I'm studying how does the selection of labor market entrants into large firm vary as a function of education and skills. I didn't have time to include it here, but hopefully I can show you at some other time. So let me now conclude with a very brief summary of what I've shown you. I use this data on workers' cognitive skills from 19 countries, and I show that those who encountered worse labor market conditions during the late teens and early 20s have lower cognitive skills many years down the road. Earliness seems to matter, meaning that unemployment rates during the late teens and early 20s have an impact that later unemployment rates don't. skill inequality is also impacted. The skill losses are mostly driven by those whose parents were least educated. And then using this German panel data on skills, I showed that there's some evidence that employer quality is one mechanism showing that young workers at the largest German firms experience the greatest skill growth. And that's all. So thank you very much.
Great. Okay, we'll go right to Abby Wozniak for a comment.
Okay, sounds good. So the ASSAs are obviously a kind of organization to help us solve coordination problems. But one of the things that I learned this year is that it's still hard to kind of sort out if you should discuss an underlying paper or you should discuss the papers and proceedings. And so I'm going to be telling you about the P&P, which was the version of Jaime's paper that I read. The one that he just presented, which makes complete sense that he presented it to you, is forthcoming. So I thought there would be more value added on the P&P. I think a lot of what I have to say is pretty generalizable. So let me just get on with that after highlighting the bright orange Federal Reserve disclaimer at the bottom of my slide here. So Jaime actually told you about the research agenda. That's the second bullet point on this slide. What his papers and proceedings project does is follow up on that very last point that he made, which was to think about really the determinants that are associated with employment at large firms for young workers just entering the labor market. So it's very much in the P&P project, a determinants paper. And it focuses on really two factors that can determine entry into a large firm at early labor market, at the labor market entry point. The first factor is years of education. And the second factor is the PIAC numeracy scores. And like this paper, it's also in a cross-country context. So it's really a cross-country comparison that looks at whether having more education or having a higher numeracy score is predictive of starting to work at a large firm. And this is part of a research agenda that's really endeavoring to get into that black box of how entry labor market conditions affect long-run outcomes, with an emphasis on the role of large firms as a major mechanism in that. So I will kind of quickly say what I think the P&P project should have, because I think there's a little bit of time to revise that. And I think some of this is general to this entire literature. The first one is really more acknowledgement of the normative questions that these findings raise. And I think that applies to many folks working in this area. What should policymakers do with the information that we are uncovering of these very broad cohort effects of entry labor market conditions? Even if you can't answer that question, I think it's no longer sufficient for any of us to say that our literature or our research informs our understanding of inequality and just stop there. I think we need to spell out what questions our work might raise so that folks kind of understand really the boundaries of what we can and can't say with it. I would also like to see a little more kind of pressing on the education measures that Jaime has. So in the PIAC data, years of education is available. I don't know enough about it to know, but it would be really great if we could classify education into things that are more policy operationalizable. So is this associate's level education? Is this technical level education? Is this a BA or a BA equivalent level of education? I think trying to parse out that education and make it a little more granular would be great. And I also think in the P&P project, the kind of difference between education and skills is kind of taken as sort of absolute and fixed. And in fact, I think it's very hard to know, especially in a cross-country context, whether it's really education itself doing the work or whether it's skills doing the work. And what we're learning in this cross-country context is really just which one of these things is a better predictor of working at a large firm. It's hard to know in the cross-country context whether education is just proxying for skills in some way in certain countries that it doesn't in others, and vice versa for the skills. So I think trying to think about that distinction as well as maybe doing a little bit of simple steps to make it more granular would be great. That's really my bottom point. I'll skip over that third point and send those comments separately. So I think the last thing is just to kind of highlight what ongoing research should think about here. I already mentioned making this link to policy a little bit more explicit. So again, this is not necessarily something that can be resolved in a single paper, much less a P&P, but really spelling out what are we supposed to make of these findings that suggest that inequality might be affected by entry labor market conditions. One thing we would all like to know, I think, is how much inequality is exacerbated by entry labor market conditions. And this kind of magnitude question is very much out there. It's not clear, I think, even after looking at this for several years, like I and some of the others in the room have done, is that it's not clear enough that this contribution to inequality is even large enough to merit a policy remedy. Doesn't mean it's not worth studying, but that's a big open question that I think deserves more future attention. If it's big enough to merit a remedy, what would that remedy look like? I certainly think that this project is one that can feed into that longer run research agenda. I do want to pick up on a thread that Adriana mentioned in her comments as well. I had the same comment around this paper, is that I think more work needs to be done to separate out these cohort impacts into impacts on workers who have more skills of whatever skill we're studying. Here there's two sets versus workers who have less. In some of my now middle-aged work, I see some evidence that the impacts of entry labor market conditions actually dissipate for those without a BA. They don't last as long. And therefore, in my work, that rationalized maybe not moving to take advantage of them. But I think understanding really what dissipates for workers with fewer skills versus what doesn't is really important. And I think that Jaime has a great data set to work on that. Finally, I just look forward to learning more from the PIAC. I'm really glad that Jaime has picked that up. I don't think it's gotten enough attention from researchers, and I'm glad to see it starting to enter the mainstream. Thanks.
Terrific. Okay, we have actually 5 minutes remaining for questions from panelists or from participants. Also, Jaime, if you would like to respond, yeah, why don't you start? We start there.
Yeah, no, yes, thanks. I just wanted to thank Abigail. It was great. There's a very great comments. And yeah, I agree with her that it's important to think about the policy and normative implications. I'm glad to be pushed to do that, and I can try to work out on the papers and proceedings. And yeah, the magnitudes on the effects of inequality, I also think that's a relevant point. It's hard to do. So in the paper I just showed, I tried to do that based on parental education, but yes, with better data, it could be nice to try to tease out what that means in terms of magnitudes for measures inequality. So yeah, those are great suggestions. I'm very glad to have. Thanks.
I think we have a question from Steve Ross.
I wanted to talk a bit about your mechanism. The mechanism you're pushing is one where essentially, if I am working in a non-recession time in my early 20s, I can get better at math and English through that experience. But if I'm working in my late 20s or in my 30s, I can't improve my English from a non-recession work experience or my math from a non-recession work experience. That seems a little strong to me in terms of what could be driving these effects. One other thing to look at is what's special essentially about the early 20s is actually the lost work time, right? It's not necessarily that work time is less valuable because we're in a recession. It really is that in the early 20s, being in a recession is going to cost people possibly years of work experience, and that's much less likely to happen in your late 20s and your 30s. And we know from research and education that there's a lot of heterogeneity in the return to higher education. So when you focus on this low education parental background, you're focusing on a population that might get a lot less return from higher education and a lot more return from the labor market. So when a recession forces them out of that high return sector, it really costs them.
Mm-hmm. Yes, no, you make a good point. So I think I personally said a mechanism. I don't think it's the only one for sure. The one you're talking about, which is spending less time working and skill losses due to being unemployed for longer, it's for sure it's operating back there. I didn't explore it as much because there's already quite great literature documenting these effects. Whereas I feel that this other mechanism, which is not like conditional on working, where you're working is also going to impact how much you learn, is less explored in literature. But I agree. I don't think it is the mechanism. I think it's a mechanism, and the one you're proposing, I'm sure it's operating back there, but there's great evidence on. And then you're saying, well, it could be that different people have different returns to the same type of education. Yeah, that's a possibility. So I didn't have time to show this, but once that you look at the education responses that I mentioned that I estimate, you do see that the ones that react the most are the ones with the most educated parents. Yeah, I don't know if that's because of differential returns or because they have an easier time adjusting to bad economic times. Some people do not have the ability to in bad economic times invest more in education, but quite the opposite. But yeah, that's certainly another possibility.
Terrific. Okay, so we're actually just on time right now. So our next speaker is Jonas. I may not pronounce that correctly. Speaking about pure chance jobs versus the labor market. Please go ahead. You have 15 minutes.
Great. Let me see. Let me just share my screen. Okay. Can you still see this? Full screen now? Okay, great. Okay, thank you very much, David and Stephen, for organizing this great session.
I can't
Sorry,
see.
we see a black screen. We see it. It's full, but there's nothing on it.
Okay, let me. I think I have to stop. Then I have to go to share screen. How do I get? Once I'm in share full screen, how do I get Zoom? Oh, here we go. Sorry, I haven't taught over Zoom yet, so I'm not. I'm a rookie. Now it's good. Okay, great.
That's good.
So this paper is joined with Ashna Arora from University of Chicago and Len Joff, who's a grad student here at Columbia, and he's on the market. He's fantastic, and you should all take a close look at him. A very clunky title. Suggestions for a clearer title are certainly welcome. I hope I will be able to show you what this is about. This is all about. So sort of the question that we start with is the same one as Jaime in a sense, and this sort of broader literature. Does her work as first job affect her long run career trajectory? So this, in our view, and I think from most economists' views, is something that sort of depends on defining really big, important characteristics of the labor market. Some of them have to do with sort of how well the labor market functions, so to do with allocation of talent and so on, and others we can sort of think of as having more to do with just how the labor market functions. If the answer to that first question is yes, then a second question is also very important, sort of underappreciated a little bit maybe, is sort of to what extent these first job effects, although there have been a lot of talk of them today already, but to what extent do these first job effects vary across workers of different types? So this, from the perspective of our paper, is very important because if worker A and B have very different first job effects, as we'll call them, of starting their career at employer A, then and only one of them gets a job there, then if it's the first or the second worker, matters for sort of the total size of the pie in the long run, if you will, even beyond equity and so on. So supposing that there is in fact these heterogeneous first job effects, so that there's sort of scope for policy to influence the aggregate performance of the labor market as measured through first job effects, then a second question, sort of a third question, is it in fact the case that there are alternative ways to organize the market? Is there room, are there other things that a so-called normal labor market, a free labor market, that would influence the total size of the pie, if you will, sort of the realized first job effects? It might not be sort of known to some of you guys that there's a huge number of workers in the world that get their first job not in a quote unquote regular labor market, but through centralized mechanisms. So very many countries allocate things like workers like doctors, teachers, police officers, tax collectors, elite bureaucrats, and so on and so forth, basically public sector workers, to their first job using centralized mechanisms. And of course, the centralized, sort of fully centralized mechanism and a free labor market, if you will, a decentralized labor market we can think of those two as sort of polar opposites to some extent. But there are, of course, also intermediate points on that scale, right? So, for example, our labor market for economists that is ongoing right now is, we might think of as somewhat intermediate between those two points. So it seems, based on the prior literature, we're of course standing on the shoulders of giants here, that the answer to the first question is indeed yes. But we think it's important that what we know about this so far, this sort of first job effects in general, generally comes from cohort variation, right? Which is of course important in and of itself, but does matter for how we interpret the estimates. So we're going to instead be thinking about individual level shocks to your first job, and we find that exciting. But in a sense, I think it's the more exciting thing about our paper in our mind is that we can actually study this sort of market design policy directly, if you will, because we saw a change in how this labor market that we're studying is organized partway through our sample. Okay, so that is sort of that's the motivation. What do? We exploit the fact that in Norway until 2013, doctors were allocated to their first job using what's called a random serial dictatorship. So if you haven't heard about this before, what this means is that there's a lottery, and then the person who draws number one picks first among the available positions. Then the person who drew number two picks among the next ones, and so on and so forth. So this is a mechanism that's heavily studied by theorists, although that's and has appealing characteristics like incentive compatibility, but that's not really the reason why it was used in Norway. It was replaced with a quote unquote regular labor market, so decentralized job finding, where the workers have to find their first job on their own, in 2013, which we'll exploit. So we're going to estimate first job effects, exploiting shocks to the initial choice set, focusing. So the way that we're going to sort of define employers or hospitals is as the more popular ones, as measured in these lottery draws, versus less popular ones. And we will, when I say worker type, I mean for the P&P, I mean male versus female workers. Then we will, so the lottery number that a type of worker needs to have in order to choose a certain type of hospital, of course, says something about how much they like that type of hospital. And we'll exploit that along with our estimated first job effects to also isolate a measure of amenity value, as we'll call it, the amenity value that a given group of workers associate with a given employer. So which is, this is sort of a new way of getting at amenity value. I don't know if that's the right term, so definitely let me know if it's not the right term, but this turns out to be very useful for us. And then at the end, I'll show you how realized first job effects and realized amenity values differ in the two types of systems. By the way, just as an aside before I get into the details, some of you might know that I'm a development economist, and you might be wondering why I'm studying Norwegian doctors. I think there's two reasons. One is these types of systems, like the one that we're studying, although certainly not only this one, I find extremely exciting in terms of the fact that you both get random variation in who ends up where, but you also get to see selection. So being able to kind of compare the treatment effects of different employers with who selects into them, I think is very exciting. And then being able to compare that before and after the change in how the market is organized. Okay, so the setting, I'm probably already low on time, so I'm really only going to tell you guys, I'll skip the slide and tell you guys two things. One is that you should keep in mind that the RSD, the random serial dictatorship in Norway, was executed in real time. So sort of an exciting thing for the doctors. You're told your lottery number, you show up at a certain time online or back in the day physically. You're given your choice set and you choose. That's it. So we see we see your lottery number and we see your first job, and we can infer your choice set. And then the other thing that you should know is that post-reform, the hospitals and the workers look very similar to what they did pre-reform, except for the fact that they are, I think, instead of 54%, they are 61% likely to be female. Okay, what do we do? So it's going to feel a lot like a methodological presentation, which is because we're extremely keen to hear what people think about this methodology that we came up with. So we'll use the lottery to try to construct valid instruments for employers. This turns out to be a bit more complicated than one might think because of heterogeneity in preferences, for one. Right, so it's natural to assume that different workers have different preferences over different employers, but we don't observe preferences, at least not fully. Right, so you can't. So this is going to create some challenges because we can't just sort of control for preferences. It turns out to be the case that it's not the case that two workers in general have the same probability distribution over choice sets. But it is the case that two workers with the same preferences have. And that's sort of how to think about it. It's pretty easy to illustrate with an example, but I probably shouldn't go into that. It has to do with, anyway, I shouldn't go into it. What are we going to do about this? So first we'll partition workers into groups. So in this case, gender. We could assume that groups provide a good proxy for preferences, and then make the IV assumption conditional on group, which is indeed would be a valid thing to do if preferences are homogeneous within groups. We don't actually have to do that. If the number of workers is quote unquote large relative to the number of employers, then the IV assumption is going to hold approximately even with heterogeneity in preferences within groups. In the full-length paper, we show that this indeed seems very likely to be the case in our study. So that seems to be okay. Now, how are we going to actually construct these instruments? So this mu, which we'll focus on the expected, so as I'll say more about later, we'll focus on earnings 5 years out, conditional on H being your first employer for group G. You should think of that as sort of the causal effect of starting your career at that employer. The other kind of tricky thing that we have to think about is monotonicity. Right? If there's heterogeneity in first job effects themselves, then monotonicity in sort of the strict normal sense of the word probably doesn't hold here. It turns out that these mu's are identified even with heterogeneity in the first job effects, as long as there's some positive probability that some workers will face a choice set containing the single employer H. So Len, my co-author, has a paper on this, and also a very interesting paper by Markstein and company. Unfortunately, it doesn't turn out to be that helpful for us in this case because of our moderately sized sample size. So I think we have 9,000 workers pre-reform, for example. So we just don't have enough people who end up with a sort of single employer choice set.
And just want to let you know you have 4 minutes remaining.
Yeah. So we need some selection, some restriction in order to make estimation feasible here. We're going to assume limited selection on gains. So what this means is that the difference in the first job effect of working at H1 versus H0 is going to depend only on those two employers and which group you're in. So we're basically going to rule out selection on unobserved heterogeneity and gains within the groups. This is less strong than it might seem. So for example, you can have selection on levels, and of course that within groups, and of course across groups you can have whatever you want. Okay. So we're going to, as I said, focus on these categories of employers, the popular ones versus less popular ones, and male versus female workers. One more thing I want to tell you about our methodology. So in 2013, they introduced sort of a regular labor market, and we see allocations in both periods. We're going to take the following, assume that the preferences take the following quasi-linear form. So mu, the first job effect, plus the amenity value. So V is going to be sort of the systematic component of utility for group G of employer H. The quasi-linearity assumption is going to pin down a scale for utility. So basically, this can now be measured in dollars. And note that we can also fix a location normalization for each I. So we're going to basically have sort of a benchmark employer for which we assume that utility is 0. This amenity value measure is then going to be the group's average willingness to pay beyond their first job effect to move from that H0 to some more desirable employer. I can tell you more about how we define that group. Believe me, it's not places that most people in Norway want to live. Okay, so R is going to be worker I's lottery number, and small r, remember I said early on that this is sort of you can think of this as kind of a reasonable proxy for your preferences for a given employer, right? So this is the lottery number that workers in group G need to have in order to choose H. So basically, if two employers share a given R, but differ in their estimated first job effects, then we would think that the amenity values have to kind of offset such that people end up choosing them with the same lottery number. So this is now going to support assuming that this R is a decreasing function of VGH as well as the other V's. I realize this is probably where things start to get, I'm probably moving a little bit fast, but let me just push on it. I'm happy to continue talking about this post session. We need some assumption of the functional form of that. So this does not sort of easily map to the logit, which some of you might be thinking about. We're going to basically assume the simplest functional form that can reasonably rationalize the data. So RG is going to be alpha, an intercept alpha sub G minus B times VGH. And now the goal is of course to use the estimated first job effects, which I haven't shown you yet, but I've shown you how I will estimate them. And then the observable R is to pin down the amenity value, right? So that's the goal here. It turns out we are one equation short, if you will. We have 4 employer categories, so popularity essentially, 4 employer popularity categories to 2 demographic groups, and then the normalization I told you about. We need one more restriction. What is that going to be? So plotting the estimated first job effects. So basically, we can sort of take differences and net out alpha and beta. If we then plot the estimated first job effects against the lottery numbers, we'll see that the difference between the least, sort of the bad employers and the most desirable employers is very similar for men and women, both for R and mu, right? So this is now going to be our assumption because this suggests that the difference in the amenity value also has to be very similar, right? So I am getting very close to showing you our results. What this is saying intuitively is of course that men and women have the same willingness to pay in excess of their earnings for the large urban employers in category 1 compared with the undesirable ones in category 4. Okay, so now we have
Jonas, you're officially out of time, so could you please go through the results quickly?
Yeah, sure. So we have our estimated amenity values. We can now compare, because we observe matches, we can compare pre and post reform sort of function, performance of the market. And here are our results. I only have one result slide. So these yellow numbers are first job effects that you can compare to these numbers down here. So basically it is indeed the case that you have significantly higher earnings at the most desirable category. But interestingly, actually, the biggest first job effect is for the second most unpopular category, 5 years out. They are, if we compute sort of the total expected earnings 5 years out, they're significantly bigger for men. So Norway not doing so great in that respect. Let me skip the estimates of amenity values and just show you the headline numbers. Post-reform differences coming from these matches. Total realized earnings 5 years out, first job earnings, are actually lower under the free market than they are under the RSD system. But this is offset by amenity values, which are significantly higher under the new system. And so it turns out that the free market does sort of perform better than a random serial dictatorship in terms of total worker welfare. Okay, thank you very much, and sorry for rushing so much.
Great. Okay, so John Haldewanger will be our discussant.
Great. Let me start sharing screen. Okay, I was glad Jonas got to the punchline, so I didn't have to. As you can see by the presentation, it's very carefully done and actually creative study on a topic that we're all interested in is, okay, what are the determinants of early in the career of various shocks, and as Jonas nicely motivated in the paper nicely motivates, there's lots of work, important work, as we've just seen in earlier papers, on general labor market conditions or even local labor market conditions. And what's nice about this work is I think they somewhat overstate that there aren't other papers like this, although not exactly like this, of course, on idiosyncratic shocks, but certainly interesting. And the punchline, as you've just heard, interestingly, with all this, a careful identification and so on, is winning the lottery is valuable. That's one piece that you get out of it. And second is decentralization actually makes the residents better off in terms of welfare. Although what's interesting is slightly worse in terms of monetary value, but they make up for it in amenities. So my comments are going to be partly about, okay, how to think about this particular kind of application. I mean, this is very clever and creative methodology. So the first thing I did was I tried to remind myself of the US system. And the question is, why is that important? Well, it's going to come up in a couple of ways. As I checked this out. I actually know people who've gone through the US system, probably most of us do. And then I spent a little bit of time studying the US matching process. It's quite different than the RST. It's a multi-step process. It involves first stage ranking, it involves interviews, it involves final rankings, and then of course the Nobel Prize winning algorithm from economics that's used for matching. So the key points that I'll come back to are two. One is preferences of employers matter a lot in the US system. And so it's a system that's, as Jonas was talking about, is quite centralized, but it's not just one-sided. It's clearly two-sided. Second, and this seemed to be, I couldn't gather from the paper. In the United States, this isn't just by hospital. This is by specialty, by detailed specialty. And I didn't see any discussion of specialties. There's a footnote about specializations, but specialties generate enormous differences in earnings outcomes post-residency. And second, the nature of the post-residency career is quite different, as I'll come back to. And again, I would think that might be true in Norway as well. And so the question is, what's the role of specialties in one, there are two key sets of estimates. One in terms of the monetary value, where do they show up there? What's that variation? They talked about preferences and they and the like, and more desirable hospitals, but nothing about preferences, specialties. And it seems to me that has to be important. Somewhat relatedly, the question is, and Jonas acknowledged this, that by amenities they mean basically anything that they that can kind of account for the variation that they're seeing in terms of the rankings, relative to the monetary value. And we just saw, that there was, I'll say, you saw quite strong identifying assumptions are needed to get there, and amongst other things, it's somewhat unclear what sort of relationships are permitted between the idiosyncratic heterogeneity and the groups. But I also found, again, much of the discussion on what was in an amenity context, but again, once you think about specialties, and again, I don't know what the Norwegian system is, but in the United States, if you're in particular specialties, there's strong incentives to do post-residency fellowships. And those post-residency fellowships may not pay very well at all at first. That's not a great first job, but lead to great things. And so again, I think I worry about the role of specialties in both in the estimates of both of their components. Where do the specialties show up in both the monetary value and in the amenities, and also to the extent that there is this post post-residency fellowships and different career paths, where again does that show up? So the third comment is, and they, you know, they are about welfare of the residents, but presumably for welfare, we actually care about, I'll say productivity and welfare more generally, and presumably that should depend on the outcomes of the patients, both in the short run and the long run. And obviously the old RSE system didn't take into account preferences of employers at all. One very interesting question in the context of this decentralization is now hospital preferences seem to be incorporated, and does that lead to better or worse outcomes for patients? I know that would require much additional data, but quite important. And more generally, I think, you know, my sense that, you know, lots of us who study sorting in the labor market, we're spending a lot of time trying to figure out whether good employers match up with good workers. I mean, it's probably, you know, one of the hottest topics out there in terms of, you know, how well the labor market is functioning. Presumably exactly the same thing matters for hospitals, and it would be very good to think about that. And I think it's actually even more complicated in a hospital setting. Obviously, it's really hard to measure outcomes, output outcomes in the hospitals. I know the healthcare specialists out there struggle with this a lot, but they made enormous progress. One of the things in terms of this residency and so on is the rural hospitals maybe just doing very different things, right? That what's going on is they are basically primary care centers for, you know, vanilla kind of emergencies, routine care. And so even somebody who lives out in the rural area would come obviously to big cities for the kind of specialized treatment. So again, you know, you can see a core theme in my remarks is what's the role of specialties, including in terms of how that varies across locations, and in turn, how that's going to be related to I'll call it the general welfare, or including the productivity of hospitals in terms of outcomes and welfare. And then finally, you know, this is a very particular labor market. This is very, we're all always envious of the great Norwegian data because they have great data that you can track over time. I think there are more papers. He has actually his job market paper is somewhat related. You might say, well, maybe it doesn't have quite as airtight IV, but nevertheless, it's looking for idiosyncratic shocks. Matthew Steger, who happens to be a student of mine on the market this year, is also looking at idiosyncratic shocks. And you know, I think there is enough out there. It would be useful, certainly, to think about, well, where do the kind of results for this quite specialized market fit into the literature where other kinds of idiosyncratic shocks also matter. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. We just have a few minutes. Jonas, do you want to respond very quickly before we take other questions?
Let me just say one thing. So thank you so much, John. Super helpful. I guess the only thing I'll say is that everything, I kind of agree with everything you said. And including for sure that, you know, we didn't mean to leave out any sites that sort of, we were kind of rushing to get the PNP ready, and we will do a more careful job before finalizing it. We're trying to write two papers. We want to sort of have this kind of one paper on kind of labor market, you know, studying labor markets, and then another on medical outcomes, because I completely agree that in a sense, you know, there's some very important outcomes there to look at also, and you know, the Norwegians have good data on that stuff also. So all like great points. Thank you so much.
We have a question from ASSA support. Do you want to go ahead? Okay, maybe that's an unintended handoff. Other questions? Other participants or attendees? Okay, I have a question. This seems like the last place in the world where you would want to use a random allocation system. This random serial, like what was the idea there? What did they think that they were? What was the benefit that anyone would have had in mind of randomly assigning doctors to hospitals?
Sure. So there was some notion of equity. I think primarily from the perspective of locations. You know, they sort of thought that like no one will want to go up to the border with Russia, and so you're not going to get good doctors up there if you don't have some system like this. Combined with actually the thing that we want to look at is, does that first job then affect long-term location, right? Because I think that there was some idea that because this is like 18 months, right? There's some notion that like people will then discover that actually it's pretty great up there, and then maybe you end up staying. So I think equity was sort of the primary concern.
That makes a lot of sense. And I guess that was my next question actually, is how long are you stuck there? And it sounds like it's only a year and a half.
It's only a year and a half. If there are sort of long-term effects on where people are in the long run, then that's something that could be exploited in a later study on medical outcomes, I think, potentially, right? Because then the lottery will affect sort of the long-term distribution of doctors. But it remains to be seen. I suspect that there is some effect. I don't know if it's large enough to exploit in a paper.
So one last remark, only because we have 1 minute. That is, I fully understand why the welfare, like at least from the doctor's perspective, this was welfare improving. I'm actually surprised that the wage effects were of going to a free market were negative. I would have thought, since you're being randomly assigned workers, like wages are irrelevant. So why wouldn't wages be lower in a setting where you have captive supply?
Yeah, it's good. It's a good question, and we haven't dug into it enough. You know, there's lots of like really interesting stuff to look at, I think, in terms of who actually ends up where, and we need to do that. I think we have sort of everything we need to look at that more carefully. We haven't quite gotten there.
Okay, terrific. Well, we're exactly on time, so I have to. This 15-minute for 20-minute talk thing works just as intended. Okay, so the last presentation is by Steve Ross and Pat Ukill, and Pat will be giving the presentation. You have 15 minutes, and then I will be discussing.
Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me and see the screen. Thank you. This paper that I'll be presenting today is joint with Steve Ross at the University of Connecticut. Just as a motivation, we know that industries in general tend to differ along different dimensions, either in the prevailing wages, the sizes of the firms within the industry, in terms of potential for workers learning, the nature of the product sold, the type of tasks required to be performed in the occupations. So workers within industries may gain either industry-specific or firm-specific skills, and also the success of the industry could potentially affect the bargaining power of the incumbent workers. And as we've seen in the literature and also in the 3 papers that preceded this presentation, we know that initial or entry labor market circumstances do matter for workers. Very generally, entering the labor market during adverse circumstances does tend to influence long-term earnings, and the initial jobs at larger firms or higher paying firms versus smaller firms do also influence future worker outcomes. We know that job displacements tend to have long-lasting effects on earnings, and sometimes those negative effects are often larger for workers with a lower level of skills. So in terms of what this paper does, we are examining the growth in earnings of workers over a long time horizon, generally 10 years, for 3 separate cohorts of the National Longitudinal Surveys, the 1966 cohort, the 1979 cohort, and the 1997. Also, as an additional analysis, we are looking at a much longer time period, 20 years for the 1979 cohort, because of the availability of data for that specific survey. We are comparing the earnings growth over this long-term time period to the employment growth in the youth's initial industry of employment. Specifically, we are asking the question whether the future growth in employment of the industry that the the youth first starts to work in, whether that influences their future earnings. So it's basically like looking at the relationship between your initial choice of an industry and how your earnings trajectory ends up looking like long term. Then we go on to examine how much this relationship could be explained by all the predetermined pre-labor market observables. And for this, we are using the National Longitudinal Survey's very, very rich collection of data, not just on the measures of education and ability, but also on the huge amount of data that they have on non-cognitive skills, cognitive skills, and also social skills, as well as utilizing a very detailed information on family background. We then go on to test whether the effects differ by time that the youth spends in this initial industry, and whether the effects differ based on the type of tasks required to be performed, and also the offshoreability factor. And we're looking at these across occupations, the initial occupation. We focus very specifically on male workers, and we are excluding anyone who was employed in the agricultural sector and also in the armed forces. In order to maximize the sample that we observe for each cohort, for all three NLS cohorts, we look at male workers who declared the first industry within 7 years of initial full-time employment. By full-time, we are considering 30 hours worked per week. So for each individual across all three cohorts, we calculate the earnings growth or the wage growth, and we also calculate the employment growth of the initial industry based on the year that we first observe this industry. As for these two measures, we are using the 3-survey moving average to measure both earnings and employment at both the beginning of the time period, 10 or 20, and also at the end. In order to get the employment data, we are using the current employment statistics establishment payroll survey of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Going a little deeper into the type of individual level data that we are utilizing, we include all the different individual components of the ASVAB, which is the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery. And just for reference, 4 components of that is used to measure the AFQT score, or the Armed Forces Qualification Test score. In addition to the individual components of the ASVAB, which give us a measure of their skills, we not only do we use that, we also use different measures of non-cognitive skills and social skills for the 1979 and the 1997 cohort. For this, we are inspired by the 2017 David Deming's QJE paper, which basically says that it's not just your non-cognitive skills, your social skills also matter a lot when it comes to labor market performance. We control for family income. We delve a little deeper and we kind of look at every individual and we see whether they were living at home with their family in the first initial year. We exclude the youth's own earned income from family income if the youth was living at home. On the other hand, if the youth was not living at home, we omit the family income, but we allow for a greater influence of parental education using interactions. Now, just to give an overview about the main results that we find, in general, we find a very strong, persistent relationship between your chosen initial industry's performance over time and the growth in your average real earnings. Now I'm going to explain what each of these 4 columns are looking at. The first column is basically our baseline model, where we are only conditioning upon the age at first survey and the entry year fixed effect. We are not controlling for any kind of individual control or any kind of family background controls. Once we control for the individual's demographic and education variables, we see a slight erosion, or we see an erosion in the estimates. When in the second column, we include our initial age at first survey and end-year fixed effects, but we also include every single demographic data that we have on the individual. And in addition to those, we also use all the education variables that we can get: cognitive, non-cognitive, and social skills. Then in column 3, we try to control for one other unobservable that tends to typically confound such questions, and we control for all the family background variables that we have available in the NLS surveys. we find that when we control for the family background, moving from column 2 to column 3, we barely have any erosion of estimates for all the 3 cohorts. In the final column, in column 4, we include an initial region fixed effect because that also tends to bias such research questions. And once again, we do not find any significant erosion of estimates when we add our initial region fixed effect. So just to give you a sense of what these results say, we find that one standard deviation change in the employment growth of your initial industry implies a changes in earnings of about 6% of a standard deviation for the 1966 cohort, a 9% of a standard deviation for the 1979 cohort, and about a 7% for the 1997. We do see that the point estimates for the 97 seems to be larger than the one for the 79, but when we look at the standardized effects, they are actually lower because there is a much lower volatility in the industry growth, in the industry employment growth for the 1997. Then we conduct a large amount of robustness checks. So in the main results, we had looked at all individuals who declared an industry within 7 years to maximize the sample. But an initial industry choice could very well be considered something that is considering a much smaller time frame. So now as a restriction, we restrict the sample to only those individuals who have declared the initial industry within 2 years of full-time work entry into the labor market. And we find that our results are robust to this restriction. As a second robustness, we now change the way we identify our initial industry. Instead of basing it upon full-time employment or 30 hours per week worked, we are now changing the way we define our initial labor market entry, and we now base it upon the completion of any initial spell of higher education, which is not something that we had considered in our main results. And once again, we find that when we change our initial industry definition to control for all completion of higher education, our results remain robust, but the effects in the 1997 cohort is about 22% larger. Taking advantage of the fact that the 1979 survey allows us to look at a much larger time frame, we find very similar results over 20 years. So the results remain very persistent. The relationship, the point estimates look a little smaller, but again, there is more variation in employment growth. So the standardized effect is about the same. Now, as a placebo test, we are now trying to see if any future employment growth for the 1979 survey could explain the earnings within the first 10 years. Our hypothesis is that we shouldn't see a significant relationship over here, and the results are in line with our hypothesis. We do not see any significant relationship between the future employment growth in the next 10 years and the earnings that each of these workers have earned in the first 10 years. Now we are trying to see some heterogeneity, and the first one that we are trying to see is whether it is not just the initial industry, but also the time spent in the initial industry. So we divide the sample into 2 groups. We look at workers who persisted for at least 5 years and workers who did not persist for 5 years, but left the industry, the initial industry, within 1 to 4 years. And for each of the 3 cohorts, we do not find a significant difference. And we basically do not see any significant difference that is statistically different from 0. It actually doesn't matter whether you persisted in this initial industry or not in terms of your long-term growth in average real earnings. Now, going by much of the offshoreability factor work that was done in Otter and Dawn 2013, we now divide the sample between into occupations, initial occupations, showing above medium share of offshoreability factor and below medium share of offshoreability factor. And what we find is that only for the 1966 cohort, we find a significantly larger effects for above median offshoreability for routine tasks for the 1966 cohort, but the effect tends to dissipate when we look at the 1979 and the 1997. I apologize, I mean offshoreability factor. Now moving on to the final heterogeneity that we do, where we divide it, again following the Otterendon 2013, we divide each initial occupation by the share abstract above and median, share routine above and median, and then the share manual above and median. What is interesting is that, again, for the 1966 cohort, we find much larger effects for those that were in above median routine tasks. The reason we have not shown the 1979 cohort results over here is that this significantly larger effect that we see for the 1966 for the above routine, share routine above median, this effect dissipates or disappears for the 1979. Interestingly enough, for the 1997 cohort, we see a slight reversal in the results, even though it's not statistically significant. But we do kind of see a phenomenon where the effects seem to be slightly larger for below median share routine instead of the above median share routine that we had seen for the 1966 cohort. So the results do kind of show, although it's very noisy, the results do kind of show a reversal over time, where instead of the effects focusing on or being concentrated on above median share routine, the results seem to be slightly converging towards the below median share routine in the initial occupation task content. So as a conclusion, this was a very short presentation for me. We see that the employment growth in the initial industry is very strongly correlated with the workers' earnings growth. Over half of the effect is associated with the individual's skills and the individual attributes. And we find that the remaining effect is very stable to controlling any kind of family background. So we find that even when we control for all individual demographics, all individual skills, ability, cognitive, non-cognitive, social skills, and also when we control for their family background, we do not find any erosion of the estimates. And again, controlling for the initial region fixed effect, we do not find any erosion of the estimates. Our results remain robust to different definitions or alternative definitions of initial industry. Our results are robust to the longer time frame, the 20 years time horizon that we look at for the NLSY 79 and the 97. And we also pass the falsification test using future employment growth for each individual. We find similar estimates regardless of the time spent in the industry. So we cannot say that it is only those who tend to persist in their first chosen industry. Those are the ones who are showing this strong relationship. The amount of time you spend in your first industry doesn't seem to matter much in terms of the correlation over here. And in the NLS 1966 cohort, we find larger effects for offshoreable tasks and more routine initial occupation tasks. We do see a possible reversal over time with much larger effects in less routine or below median routine task content for the NLSY 1997. But these results are not statistically significant and they are noisy, so we cannot make strong claims over here. Thank you. I think I have ended the presentation before time. So I'm just going to stop sharing right now, and I'll be very happy to have all comments and feedback right now. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much. I'm gonna be the discussant, and I'll try to limit myself to approximately 5 minutes. So let me start my share. Okay. I presume you can all see that. Is that correct? Great. Okay. Great. So I enjoyed very much discussing this paper. Let me get right to the heart of it. If I can get to the next screen. Okay, great. So we have, I don't need to tell all of you, we have a lot of evidence that early life choices have long-term consequences, obviously investment choices, but also luck, graduating recession, of course, experiencing a mass layoff, classic literature on this topic, or entering a sector that experiences an adverse shock, like a trade shock or something like that. The question of this paper is, what happens if a worker chooses an unexpectedly slow growing industry? Does that have an effect on their subsequent earnings? And so what are the potential mechanisms here? Well, it could be some of the ones below. It could be that if you enter a slow growing industry, you have excess risk of a mass layoff. We know how bad that is. Maybe if you start off in the wrong place, you don't arbitrage correctly. You're just not aware for frictional reasons that there's better opportunities elsewhere, and so you kind of get stuck there, even though in fact there's a higher paying job available for you somewhere. A third is that, in job ladder models, your earnings is a function of bargaining between your current employer and successive employers. And so if you start on the wrong rung of the ladder, that will always affect, at least asymptotically, or at least for quite a long time, what your wage level is. So that would be another possibility. Or it could be that you start at a firm in a slow growing industry and you have to leave it, but you give up a match premium that you've already kind of earned. And so even though you get back onto the right track, you've given up some valuable quasi rent. And so that again will affect your well-being, your earnings over a long period of time. So there are lots of mechanisms through which this could occur. One thing that would actually help the paper would be to kind of discuss what some of those mechanisms will be, and I'll share my slides. The empirical setup, as you just saw, is we're going to regress the earnings growth of an individual who starts off in industry J0 on a number of covariates, and then the growth rate, employment growth rate. So Y is the earnings growth, G is the employment growth rate of that industry J0 that they initially started working in, even though, and of course they're not required to stay in that sector, but that's the 10-year growth rate of employment in the sector and the 10-year growth rate of earnings of the individual who started off in that sector. So the key results are the ones you already heard from Pat. The elasticity of own wage with respect to initial employment growth, industry employment growth of the initial industry is about between 0.4 and 0.6. So here in the first column, you can see, I believe you see my pointer, is that correct? Great, okay. It's about 0.81, and then you put in covariates and it falls by about half. That's true across all columns, sorry, all three data sets. So effectively, once you include covariates, it's somewhere between 0.4 and 0.6. Okay, so here, first let me give you some observations, then I'll get to my main comment. So first of all, these effect size I think of as are large, right? It says, my earnings growth rate over the next 10 years is going to be half whatever the growth rate of my industry is, and that could be a big deal. This result is not sensitive to a bunch of logical choices that you might make. So if you restrict to entering the industry within 2 years, industry identified after you've completed your schooling, using a placebo test of future industry growth in subsequent 10 years, doesn't falsify, right? Seems like the contemporaneous growth, not what happens later in that industry. If you expand the window to 20 years, which they can do in one cohort, the elasticities are about half as large again, but it's still quite substantial, right? So that itself is in no way a weakness of the result. Just two detailed questions. First of all, I would have thought you'd want to use, rather than using industry employment growth, why not use industry wage bill growth or something, right? Since the outcome is earnings. And one thing I didn't see is, are you controlling for the growth rate in the industry 10 years prior? Because we'd be worried that people are selecting into fast growing industries, and I'll come back to that point. And then the fifth point, which I want to highlight, and I'm going to say more about this in a minute, is that the point estimates fall by half when conditioning on observables, and then they don't fall further when conditioning on more observables. And I want to talk about how to interpret that. Okay, so three comments. One, the ideal experiment. Two, how do we address the selection issue? And three, what are the mechanisms? So the ideal experiment, of course, is that you would assign workers randomly to an initial industry and watch what happens. And then the outcome you look at is the correlation between the initial industry that you assign them to and the industry growth rate and their own workers' growth rate. The challenge is, of course, this isn't entirely feasible. You can't assign geological engineers to the textile sector. What does random assignment mean when employers get to choose whom to hire? Like I can go tell you to, oops, I guess I'm a little over time. So random assignment have to take the form of encouragement. And this raises a natural concern, which is that since workers are not randomly assigned, perhaps their industry selection is conflated with something about their future growth rate. And so, this seems plausible, right? Many of the best and the brightest today are entering internet businesses 20 years ago. They were looking for jobs in Wall Street. In an earlier era, they would have been looking for jobs in plastics. So for example, for those of you seen The Graduate, right? Here's the encouragement design. Ben, I just want to say one word to you. What is that word? Does everyone know? The word is plastics, right? And if you haven't seen this movie, this is the main takeaway from the presentation, which is that you should see this movie. Okay, so now let's talk about how to assess the selection issue. Are we approximating the ideal experiment? And I think it's clear, and the authors are quite cognizant of that, the answer is no. So here on the left are people who entered an expanding industry, people who entered a contracting industry. You can see the people entering expanding industry, they're more educated. Their father and mother is more educated, right? And of course, their earnings growth is much greater. This is the difference between these columns. So nothing about this says that these groups are perfectly comparable. See, okay, great. And so we see that as you include these covariates, the point estimate changes. What I want to draw your attention to is the R squared. So the R squared in the first column is 0.15, and then as we move over, it rises to 0.276. And then as we add additional covariates, it doesn't rise much further. The point estimate doesn't fall much further, but the R squared doesn't rise much further. And that's significant for the following reason. So how do we know if selection is being resolved by adding covariates? Well, the intuition of this property, if you can call it intuition, if you've read this paper, there's no intuition, let me be clear. But the intuition would be from Altanji, Elder, and Tabor, and clarified by Emily Oster's 2019 paper, is that if the estimates are stable when we add more controls, it suggests that adding all the controls would have no further effect. But this is only correct if the controls we add explain a lot of the incremental variance. If that's not true, we can't be sure we're spanning the space. Right, so let me give you for an example. I realize I'm abusing my privilege here. So imagine our outcome variable is wealth and adulthood, and we put in years of education, and we say, oh, look, it's highly correlated. You say, well, how do we know that's not biased by something else? Well, let's say we throw in, astrological sign at birth, and that doesn't move the estimate. Say, oh, it's pretty good, and then we throw in GPA and say, oh, well, look, it's correlated with education, but also doesn't move our point estimate. It certainly doesn't move the R squared by much because they're very correlated with education. Now we put in parents' wealth, right? And that's going to raise the R squared a lot, right? Because wealth is fairly heritable. It may also change our coefficient on education. And so we want, if we have a strong test, it needs to be something that's correlated with the dependent variable, as well as potentially correlated with our independent variable. So the key insight is that we need to look at the delta, the change in the beta, and the change in the R squared simultaneously, and to figure out how much of a strong test putting in more covariates supplies. So actually, here's a quick version of Emily Oster's method, right? So here is with the univariate model, then we add the controls. The beta falls from 0.83 to 0.522. The R squared rises from 0.107 to 0.230, right? So those are our deltas, delta beta, delta R squared. We now need to make an assumption. First, that the maximum achievable R squared is, let's say, 0.5. The rest is measurement error. Otherwise, it's like extremely conservative, right? If we said it was 1, then terrible things could happen. Then we want to say the omitted variables might have the same correlation to Y as the included controls, right? So now what does that say? We can use this formula for the worst case scenario for this beta, which is basically, it's the gradient of how much the coefficient falls as the R squared rises. And the answer is that it does fall a lot as the R squared rises. And so the worst case scenario here is that this beta, although it appears to be positive, could actually be negative in this bounding exercise. That doesn't mean it is. It just means there's a lot of room for additional bias to matter here. So that's important. So it's not a fatal flaw, it's a diagnostic, but it says the bound is one that would leave you still concerned. I'm running out of time, so let me just say, that was my main point. I think it would be great to just talk about a couple of the intermediating mechanisms for what's going on here. So do people who start off in slow growing industries, they spend less time in those industries, they spend more time out of the labor force, they experience slower wage hours and hours growth while in the industry, after leaving the industry, et cetera. So I'd love to know what causal models this is consistent with. So let me just conclude. So fascinating findings that are quite robust. The next step would be to think more about this omitted variables issue, to explore intermediate mechanisms, and to finally say, what does this tell us about the underlying model? Okay, I will stop there, and we have a few minutes remaining for additional discussion, and just be aware that we will have a hard stop in 3 minutes. They will cut us out because there are people waiting outside the Zoom room, like whatever that means, to use it next. So you guys are welcome to respond or use the time as however you like.
Pat, did you want to say something, or did you?
I just want to thank for the great comments. I'm going to take a detailed look at them when you share the slides with me, and I'll try my best to address. I do want to, Abigail had a question about how we should reconcile the findings on those who persist versus do not persist and the falsification test. I do appreciate this comment. I haven't thought deeply about this, but it is definitely something that I will be thinking about. And thank you once again. That was a good thing to catch. Thank you.
So I will say one thing I'll say about this issue is we struggled a bit with this because, of course, there is so much real stuff that happens, right? We're saying at time 0, this is what we know, and then we're looking at earnings, and that goes to the denominator you're talking about, right? Is that you chose 0.5, which is relatively conservative, but it's also quite possible that more than 0.5 is determined by things that come after time 0. One of the things we were trying to do was we were trying to think about if we controlled for all the individual things about the individual, just the skill information we have on skills, whether it be measures of non-cognitive or cognitive skills, education, human capital. And I guess one of the problems, of course, is that maybe we did not work hard enough to find things that matter after you've controlled for skills. One thing.
Okay, so we're about to be cut off.
Yep, sorry.
So just say you're absolutely right that the question is the R squared of things that are ex ante knowable, not things that happen afterwards. So that's exactly right. And it could be if you said the upper bound is 0.3, there's no room for further bias, right? So it's absolutely that's the argument to make in the paper.
What we probably should have done is we should not have included the demographics, right? Because the demographics are all about bias, and everything else we're including is an individual measure of skill or human capital. But so it could be that the demographics are the things that will have a lot of power for unobservables, but really aren't directly about skills and measures. And we shouldn't have included those in the individual measures in that column 2. We should have saved them for for column 3, along with family background. But that's speculation.
Okay, well, I think we're out of time. So let me thank all of you. And this is a great presentation. I look forward to seeing all of you tomorrow. And thanks especially to all the discussants for taking the time. And to Steve and Pat for organizing this excellent session.
Thank you all as well. I appreciate you participating.
Make sure to share your slides with your relevant presenters.
Thanks a lot.
Bye, everyone.
Okay.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.